Secretos en la arena. Una de las ideas más fascinantes en torno al misterioso destino de los 68 tripulantes desaparecidos del Vergul de Drake es que tal vez no perecieron en absoluto, sino que se integraron en comunidades aborígenes cercanas en los años posteriores al naufragio. Con el tiempo, han surgido varias pistas que sugieren que los marineros náufragos pudieron haber sobrevivido mucho después de su desaparición. En 1875, más de 2 siglos después del naufragio, un explorador británico se topó con un inusual anillo de piedras en la misma parte de la costa australiana donde la tripulación había estado varada. Esta extraña formación fue redescubierta en 1938 y se descubrió que consistía en dos formas rectangulares adyacentes. Uno de los individuos que examinó el sitio comentó que toda la disposición de las piedras parecía estar orientada intencionadamente, casi como si señalara hacia algo. Estos hallazgos sugieren fuertemente que los sobrevivientes podrían haber viajado más tierra adentro de lo que se pensaba originalmente, y posiblemente haber tenido encuentros o incluso interacciones prolongadas con grupos aborígenes. Algunos investigadores creen que los náufragos pudieron haber sido acogidos o absorbidos por tribus indígenas, viviendo sus vidas completamente alejados del contacto europeo o de cualquier esperanza de rescate. Si esta teoría resulta ser cierta, marcaría un caso extraordinario de intercambio cultural entre marineros europeos náufragos y los pueblos originarios de Australia, una intersección de vidas moldeadas por las circunstancias y la supervivencia. El enigmático anillo de piedras puede ser uno de los pocos signos crípticos que apuntan a este capítulo no registrado de la historia. Luego, en 1963, los restos del Vergul de Drake fueron finalmente descubiertos en aguas costeras poco profundas frente a la costa occidental de Australia. Sin embargo, en lugar de responder a las preguntas mantenidas durante tanto tiempo, el descubrimiento solo profundizó el enigma. El tesoro que, según informes, había sido rescatado por los sobrevivientes, junto con cualquier otro rastro físico de ellos, nunca fue recuperado.
The pneumatic railway. Then, in 1870, a tunnel unlike any other was completed beneath the bustling streets of New York City. It was just 312 feet long, and it only went from Warren Street to Murray Street. But what made it different was the way it moved people. This was the pneumatic railway. Essentially, it was a giant vacuum tube, a prototype for an underground subway system that didn't use steam or electricity or even a traditional engine. Instead, it used air pressure. One fan, one pipe, and one tiny train. The idea was that a massive blower at the end of the tunnel would create high-pressure air behind the train to push it forward, then reverse the airflow to suck the train back again. It wasn't fast. It wasn't even all that practical. But it did work. And in 1870, that was enough to attract a crowd. Passengers would step into a single, circular car, shaped like a barrel, lined with velvet seats, gas lamps, and crystal fixtures. It looked more like a smoking lounge than a train. Once everyone was inside, a whistle blew, the tunnel was sealed off. And the train was blasted down the line by nothing but compressed air. It took less than 30 seconds to reach the end of the line. And the ride? According to newspaper reports, smooth as silk. Now, obviously, this sounds insane, and it was. But this was a time before the modern subway even existed. The streets above were gridlocked with horses, carriages, and chaos. And the idea of escaping underneath the city, silently, cleanly, and without the choking smoke of steam engines was kind of revolutionary. But of course, there was a catch. The project was illegal. Engineer Alfred Ely Beach had built the whole tunnel in secret, working at night, bribing city officials, and disguising the entrance as a shoe store. By the time the public found out, the tunnel was already finished. But even then, it never became more than a demonstration. City politics, corruption, and the rise of electric railways meant the pneumatic system never expanded beyond that single tunnel. The fan broke. The tunnel flooded. The train disappeared. And within a few years, the whole project was sealed off and forgotten. Still, for one brief moment in 1870, New York had a functioning underground railway powered entirely by air. It was impractical, strange, and wildly ambitious. But it was also the first real subway in America. And even if it didn't last, it showed the world that the future of transportation might just be underground. The collapse. On March 3, 1905, just before the afternoon shift ended, the workers at the Broughton Glassworks were beginning to clean their stations. Molten silica hissed in the furnaces. Men in heavy aprons scraped the floors. The day had been uneventful until it wasn't. The Broughton facility was one of the largest industrial glass factories in northern England. It employed over 400 people, many of whom were veterans of mining, steel, or war. It was brutal work. Temperatures near the furnaces regularly reached 120 degrees, and the air was thick with powdered ash and fine glass dust. But what made Broughton unique was its newly installed cooling tower. A 160-foot-tall, steel-framed chimney designed to vent the factory's heat and recycle usable energy back into the furnaces. It was an experiment. Built fast, built cheap, and from the very beginning, workers had concerns. During storms, the tower swayed. When pressure built too quickly, you could hear the steel moan. The stairs to the inspection platforms were rusted. The welds often held together with makeshift clamps. Engineers promised it was safe, but they also promised production would never be interrupted. That afternoon, just after 2:45 p.m., a sharp series of cracks echoed through the upper structure. No one noticed at first. The hammering and roaring of the furnaces masked almost everything. But then came the shadow. The tower, 160 feet of steel and soot, began to bend in the middle. A groaning sound, loud enough to stop conversations. And then the bolts started snapping, one after another, like gunshots ricocheting through the factory yard. A few workers ran. Others froze, unsure of what was happening. Then the upper third of the tower sheared off completely, and with a scream of tearing metal, it fell straight through the roof of the cooling bay and into the main furnace hall. Inside, the blast of air sucked the flames from the furnaces. Molten glass exploded out of crucibles like lava. Steel support beams twisted from the heat and collapsed. The noise was deafening. People near the edge of the hall escaped, coughing and burned. But those still at the heart of the bay, especially those under the tower's impact zone, were buried in a storm of fire, brick, and steel. In less than 15 seconds, 1/3 of the facility was destroyed. And as silence fell, you could hear the low ringing of the emergency bell, struck manually by a survivor, too injured to speak. The disaster killed 39 men instantly. Another 12 died in the following days from burns and lung damage. Investigations later revealed that the tower had failed due to metal fatigue at 4 different joints, each one flagged during inspections but ignored to avoid downtime. The tower had never been fully stress tested, and the workers who died beneath it. Most had spoken up, most had warned someone, but management had targets to meet, and Broughton was behind schedule. The site was rebuilt, eventually, with stricter safety codes and redesigned structures. But for decades afterward, older glass workers would pause on windy days, look up at the replacement tower, and remember the day the sky fell in on them. 3 days in the dark. On the afternoon of October 20th, 1919, at the Levant mine in Cornwall, the workers were beginning to finish their shift. After hours in the dark, hauling ore, braving heat, dust, and danger, they were almost home. They stepped onto the man engine, a crude wooden platform system that moved with the mine's central rod, lifting men hundreds of feet up to the surface. 18 inches at a time. It was a slow ride, but it was better than climbing a 1,000-foot ladder. That day, nearly 100 men crowded onto the steps. But as the machine rose, something gave way. A bracket at the top, one that hadn't been replaced in 5 years, snapped clean off. And with a violent crack, the entire rod, hundreds of feet of timber and iron, collapsed into the shaft. Some were flung into the walls. Others dropped straight down. The main engine shattered as it fell, smashing through support beams, landings, and everything in its path. Inside the mine, the silence was replaced with screams, then the roar of collapsing rock. And then, nothing. At the surface, no one knew exactly what had happened, only that the engine had failed, and no one was coming up. A miner named John Grenfell, who had just exited moments earlier, volunteered to go back in. His father was still below. What he found were bodies. Injured men tangled in wood and stone, barely breathing, too deep to reach. There was no way down, no way up, and no time. So a call went out, not by phone, but by word of mouth. And the response was immediate. Miners from neighboring towns came running, some from the Geaver mine, others from East Pool. They brought rope, axes, candles, many still in their work gear. Because this wasn't a rescue team, it was a brotherhood. They began the descent one by one, winched by hand into the wreckage. And down below, in total darkness, the trapped miners were doing the same. Some had candles, others didn't, but they still had the ladders. And slowly, they regrouped. The injured were carried. The survivors climbed to the water pumping shaft and to the skip route. And 2 hours after the collapse, to everyone's astonishment, figures began emerging from the darkness, dust-covered, exhausted, alive. And without hesitating, many of them turned around and went back in. For 3 days, the work continued, clearing wreckage by hand, tunneling through collapsed chambers, listening for voices beneath the rock. But time was against them. They found men trapped in pockets, still whispering, still holding on. But not all made it. Some died in the darkness, waiting. 31 men were lost. 14 were found just 150 feet down. Others, deeper. The last, at 660 feet, was John Grenfell's father. The Levant mine closed in 1930, and the man engine was never used again. But for those who remember, October 1919 wasn't just a tragedy. It was a testament to the men who went back in, to the lives they tried to save, and to the strength of a community that refused to leave its own behind. Echoes beneath the rails. Among the survivors were a handful of railway workers who had been on their break in the North Annex. One of them, 19-year-old Emmett Rose, crawled through a ventilation shaft for nearly half an hour before being pulled out by emergency crews. He suffered third-degree burns to both legs, a fractured wrist, and permanent scarring on his back, but lived to tell the story. He was the last person to make it out alive. A conductor named Helen Marsh was credited with saving over 24 passengers, guiding them through smoke-choked corridors until she collapsed from inhalation. She never regained consciousness. For many of the families in the surrounding borough, the fire wasn't just a disaster, it was a final blow. 12 of the victims had just returned from serving overseas, hoping to find work at the station. Many had only been hired that month. In total, 38 people lost their lives in the fire, and another 51 were injured, some critically. But the wounds weren't just physical. A young dispatcher named Carl DeWitt developed severe PTSD from the incident after losing his older brother in the fire. He resigned 6 weeks later and was never seen in public again. An inquiry found that the electrical wiring in the East Corridor had not been replaced since the building opened in 1903. Despite repeated safety complaints from staff, no formal upgrades had ever been made. The building's outdated alarm system failed to trigger until nearly 7 minutes after the fire started. Still, the incident was ruled an accident. The company was never held liable, and compensation was minimal. To support the grieving, a community fund was launched, aiming to raise $20,000. The mayor donated his salary for the year, and several unions contributed despite opposition. A local playwright even wrote a short piece about the lives lost performed in a candlelit vigil. But none of it could replace what was gone. Zephyr Station remained closed for the next 6 years, before being partially reopened as a museum. The eastern annex, where the fire began, was never rebuilt. To this day, a plaque hangs beside the old departure board, listing each of the names of those who perished. The clock above it is frozen at 5:42 p.m., the moment the flames first touched the main line. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story or suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.